Right, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2022, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Intopia and Fable, and our Gold supporters, Barrier Break, TPGI, and UX for the Win. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have any questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag, or you can also post them in the YouTube chat for our Q&A at the end of the session. Now, I'm happy to be joined by Captain Sparkle Pants himself, my good friend Bruce Lawson, who's going to be co-hosting with me today. Bruce, over to you.
Thank you, Kaiser Cuddles. Yep, I'm delighted to be here. I have COVID, so do not kiss your TV screen or your monitor screen, please. And without further ado, to talk to us about design ethics, Kate Every. Take it away, Kate.
Thanks, everyone. I know this is a global conference, so just to situate me, I'm in Leeds, which is in the north of the UK. So hello to everyone in the UK and everyone around the world if you're dialing in from elsewhere. So the topic today is design ethics, and I just wanted to give a brief content warning before we jump in that there are some heavy topics in this talk right from the start. So stuff to do with racism, grief and loss. So just to take care and take a break, obviously, if you need to, when we're talking about these topics. I'm going to start with a story. And these are words from a blog post written by a designer called Eric Mayer. And this is what he has to say. I didn't go looking for grief this afternoon, but it found me anyway. And I have designers and programmers to thank for it. In this case, the designers and programmers are somewhere at Facebook. I know they're probably pretty proud of the work that went into the year in review app they designed and developed, and deservedly so. A lot of people have used it to share the highlights of their years. Knowing what kind of year I'd had, though, I avoided making one of my own. I kept seeing them pop up in my feed, created by others, almost all of them with the default caption, "It's been a great year. Thanks for being part of it," which was by itself jarring enough, the idea that any year I was part of could be described as great. Still, they were easy enough to pass over, and I did, until today when I got this in my feed, exhorting me to create one of my own. Eric, here's what your year looked like. A picture of my daughter who died this year. Yes, my year looked like that, true enough. My year looked like the now absent face of my little girl. It was still unkind to remind me so forcefully. And I know, of course, that this is not a deliberate assault. This inadvertent algorithmic cruelty is the result of code that works in the overwhelming majority of cases, reminding people of the awesomeness of their years, showing them selfies at a party or whale spouts from sailing boats. But for those of us who lived through the death of loved ones, or spent extended time in the hospital, or were hit by divorce, or losing a job, or any one of 100 crises, we might not want another look at this past year. To show me Rebecca's face and say, here's what your year looked like, is jarring. It feels wrong, and coming from an actual person, it would be wrong. Coming from code, it's just unfortunate. These are hard problems. It isn't easy to programmatically figure out if a picture has a ton of likes because it's hilarious, astounding, or heartbreaking. Algorithms are essentially thoughtless. They model certain decision flows, but once you run them, no more thought occurs. To call a person thoughtless is usually considered a slight or an outright insult. And yet we unleash so many literally thoughtless processes on our users, on our lives, and on ourselves. Where the human aspect fell short, at least with Facebook, was in not providing a way to opt out. The year in review ad keeps coming up in my feed, rotating through different fun and fabulous backgrounds, as if celebrating a death, and there's no obvious way to stop it. In creating this year in review app, there wasn't enough thought given to cases like mine or anyone who had a bad year. The design is for the ideal user, the happy, upbeat, good life user. It doesn't take other use cases into account. It may not be possible to reliably pre-detect whether a person wants to see their year in review, but it's not at all hard to ask politely and empathetically if it's something that they want. That's an easily solvable problem. Had the app been designed with worst case scenarios in mind, it probably would have been. If I could fix one thing about our industry, just one thing, it would be that, to increase awareness of and consideration for the failure modes, edge cases, and worst case scenarios. So today we're going to be talking about what can go wrong when we don't consider the impact of design and when we don't consider those worst case scenarios. We'll start by defining what we mean by design ethics before moving on to thinking about why it's becoming increasingly important. We'll then talk a bit about what we as practitioners can do about it. So starting with defining our terms, this really isn't a simple answer, so I'm going to break it down into its constituent parts. Design. This is a really interesting one because I think I've done this in rooms of designers and people who have design in their title or design as a key part of their role. And it's actually really challenging to come up with a definition that encompasses everything that design means. So maybe have a think for a moment about how you would define design and what keywords come to mind for you. And it might be harder than you think to nail that down. The dictionary definition gives us a definition like this. Design is the process and art of planning and making detailed drawings of something. But I don't think this really goes far enough. Design is obviously a lot more complex than that. So whilst it does incorporate creating a plan or a drawing, and this could be a diagram or an architectural blueprint, or for UX and interaction designers, it could be a prototype for an app. I'm sure most of us would agree that design is actually a lot more than that. And any other designers in the room may have felt the frustration in the past by being told by a non-designer to just make it pretty, as though design were purely about aesthetics, which it's not. It's also about process. Design is a verb as well as a noun. It's the steps that you go through in order to go from that idea to reality. So this might be something like a drawing, a plan, or a prototype, but it's also other processes like ideating, researching with users, validating ideas, iterating, building. And models like design thinking help us reconceptualize design from just being an output to being a process. But it's also about our intentions. IBM has this definition, which is that design is the intent behind an outcome. It's the things that we consider as we go through that design process. It's what we set out to do when we seek to achieve an outcome in the world. I would add to that impact. Have a little think about whether you think impact is also part of design. So once we've produced a thing in the world, whatever that is, a physical object or an app, a website, a transactional service, do we have responsibility for the impact it has on people? Or is that beyond the scope of design? Is that someone else's job? Does it stop at our kind of good intentions, as IBM's definition would suggest? Be interested in what you think about this. So if you have thoughts, please stick them in the chat or let me know afterwards. For me, I would argue that the impact of our designs is absolutely the responsibility of the designer, as much as the earlier planning stages are. And we'll talk a bit about that later on. So moving on to ethics. Similarly complex concept. I'm intrigued as to kind of what words and thoughts, definitions spring to mind when we think about ethics. And we're absolutely not going to be able to define it here because it's so huge you could do an entire postgraduate degree just on the topic. And there are many different schools of thoughts on ethics and philosophy. But we will touch on 3 key ideas around ethics. So the first one, going back to our dictionary definition, is that ethical means relating to beliefs about right and wrong. So that means it's all to do with values. But I think what the dictionary definition implies here is that there's no shared universal definition of what is or is not ethical, because everybody has a slightly different conception of right and wrong. An act may be considered ethical if it aligns with your own values. So to understand whether you think something is ethical, it follows that you need to know what your own values are. And our values are personal to us. They're our understanding of right and wrong that's informed by things like socialization, upbringing, identity, education, experiences, religion. Many other factors go into informing our own values. And to design ethically, we need to think about what we as individuals value, what we value as a design team, and also as a society. So if our key values are things like growth and innovation, that might lead us to take the approach that Uber and Google and Facebook have taken to move fast and break things. But if our key values are things like inclusion or safety, autonomy, transparency, that necessarily leads us to take a different and probably more considered, slower approach to design. Second idea is that ethical is not the same as legal. So whilst law and ethics are related to one another, laws are values that are encoded into a systematic body of rules. They've been codified, and they might be binding upon the people based on the society that they live in. Ethics aren't binding, and they are individual to all of us. They might be highly influenced by societal norms and where we live and who we interact with, but they're not legally binding on us as individuals. And what we find is that law often lags behind ethical norms. So if you think about some of the design ethics issues that we'll talk about today, there is no regulation against these things currently. The law doesn't exist to support our understanding of what's ethical in these spaces. And an example from history, the transatlantic slave trade, it was both fully legal at the time and entirely unethical. Those things are not one and the same. Third idea is to point out that even the philosophers of ethics can't agree on what we mean by ethical. There's divergence of opinion based on different philosophical schools of thought that go back thousands of years. Two that I'll pull out here. Duty-based or deontological ethics asserts that motives matter more than your outcomes. So according to this school of thought, if your intention was good, you behaved ethically, regardless of the outcome. So that's back to our IBM definition of design, that it's the intent behind what you're trying to do is your design. On the flip side, we have results-based or consequentialist ethics, which evaluates actions based on their outcome. So if the outcome produces the greatest good for the highest number of people, it can be deemed ethical. And I think what my point is here is that there's no universally recognized definition of ethical or ethics. And in fact, some definitions are openly at odds with one another, like these two. And our understanding of ethics personally is highly subjective, individual, and culturally contingent. And this is why it's so important to consider ethics in design, because there's no clear standards to follow that we can point to and we say, right, if we just follow this list, it means that our design is ethical. And it's important to think twice and build up your own beliefs that reflect your own values and not just follow the ones of your client or your employer, or maybe even the legal system where you live. And relying on the values that you personally hold will lead to your users being better protected from bad design than relying on some sort of external factor. Design intersects with ethics because of the way it shapes the world we live in. So one way to sum up this intersection is, as Peter Paul Verbeek says in his book, What Things Do. He says, things carry morality because they shape the way in which people experience their world and organize their existence. Regardless of whether this is done consciously and intentionally or not, designers materialize morality. So what is design ethics then, if we bring these two concepts together? I think you know by now I'm not going to give you a simple definition. There's no one sentence definition to this. It's a constantly evolving concept, and it's being brought together by a lot of different thinkers in the field. And people have different ideas about what we mean by design ethics. And I think as we hear different perspective and the field deepens and our understanding deepens, these definitions will shift. So here's one kind of working definition to start with. Design ethics is the recognition that we as designers are responsible for what we put out into the world. Ethical design is made up of what you do. So asking questions like, what is the problem you're designing for? Does it have the potential to be harmful? Should we be designing in this space? It's also made up of how you do it. So what processes are you following? Are they inclusive processes? Do they reflect your values? Catherine spoke earlier about including lived experience experts, which brings us on to the next point, which is who is doing it? Are there a diverse range of voices represented in the room? Are people equal partners in the process? And who is impacted by what you create, and do they have a voice, given that they are so heavily invested because of the impact that it has on their lives? And finally, this is all encompassed by how you sustain it. I think this is really, really important when we're involved in projects or teams or communities where we go in for a perhaps short period of time and engagement, and then we leave again. Is that work going to be sustained? And has the approach been participatory, involving the community, or has it been extractive, where you're kind of taking something out without giving something back? Ethical design considers impact as well as intent. It's not enough that there's good intention behind the design process. If the outcome is unintentionally harmful to people, then I would argue that it's not ethical design, even if you had the best intentions. So thinking about why we need ethical design and what can go wrong if we don't carefully consider impact from the very start. I've drawn out a spectrum of harms here because in recent years, there have been countless examples of tech causing harm as a result of unintended consequences of design. And I'm sure you've heard stories in the news of tech manipulating people, using dark patterns, machine learning models screening people out of the job market before they've even had a chance to interview, or disinformation campaigns on social media, which have affected elections. I'm not going to go into each of these areas, but there are plenty of case studies in every single one of these areas on the slide, but we will look at a few specific examples. So the first one on the less severe end of the spectrum is manipulative design, what's often called dark patterns. It's fairly frustrating, but perhaps it's not causing particular harm. You may have encountered these. If you've not come across the concept, I encourage you to go and look it up because there are some really common types of dark pattern, and you'll start to spot them everywhere. They get used on all sorts of websites. But if we move further along the spectrum of harms, we come to examples like this one, the story that we started with. And in the case of Eric Mayer, an innocuous design choice led to pain and anguish. So it might be easy to write it off as a tragic mistake that only impacted one individual user. But I'd argue that this is problematic for two reasons. One, even if it is only one individual user, this is a person and the design choices have caused harm to them, and that matters. But secondly, it's rarely ever actually just one person who's impacted. As of July this year, Facebook had 2.9 billion monthly active users. That's almost half of the population of the world. So if we took an incredibly conservative estimate and assumed that 1% of their users are having a bad day or going through something traumatic, that's 29 million people who could be affected at any given time. I think the scale of this is almost incomprehensible for us. So thinking back to that spectrum of harms, it considers both the severity of harm for individuals, but also the scale of individuals impacted. And what about where a mistake excludes or discriminates against not just individuals, but entire communities of people, for example, based on the color of their skin? So this is another example. This is a famous story where the Google Photos algorithm auto-tagged a young Black man, Jackie Alcine, and his friend as gorillas. And this type of mistake not only dehumanizes people, but it also further entrenches offensive stereotypes, so causing wider societal harm at the same time. Or in this story, where a Detroit father, Robert Williams, was arrested by law enforcement for shoplifting, then interrogated and held in custody for 30 hours. In this case, prosecutors had to drop the case because of insufficient evidence, which was the search on facial recognition technology that incorrectly pointed to his old driver's license photo as the possible match. And to quote from the article here, despite the injustice that could reasonably cause outrage for anyone, Black men in America are particularly vulnerable to interactions with the police such as this. What starts as an inconvenience could turn into a life-threatening situation. How does one explain to two little girls that a computer got it wrong, but the police listened to it anyway, Robert wrote. As any other Black man would be, I had to consider what could happen if I asked too many questions or displayed my anger openly, even though I knew I had done nothing wrong. One of the attorneys said that Robert's daughters aged 3 and 7 have been traumatized by the incident. When they see police, they wonder if they're taking daddy away. And this isn't a one-off mistake. The technology that's used in this example has been found in other studies to exhibit racial bias, and yet it's becoming more common in its use. One study found that, quote, Asian and African American people were up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white men. Native Americans had the highest false positive rate of all ethnicities, according to the study. Women were more likely to be falsely identified than men, and the elderly and children were more likely to be misidentified than those in other age groups. Middle-aged white men generally benefited from the highest accuracy rates. So these are just a few examples of harmful tech, but there are countless more. If we just look at the headlines in the news, we've got things like manipulation tactics, where governments are using nudge behavior tactics, using people's sensitive data to try and influence their behavior. There's also that example I mentioned before of people being screened out of the labour market. So tech being used to reject resumes before they're ever even seen by a human. There's damage to the mental health of teenagers. And this has been talked about more widely this year. You may have heard about Frances Haugen, the product manager at Facebook, who turned whistleblower and left and publicly shared documents that revealed that Facebook knew that its products were causing harm to the mental health of teens, particularly teenage girls, but has chosen not to fix the problem. Another example, automated systems threatening the lives of dark-skinned people. This headline here is referring to the risks of self-driving cars with dark-skinned pedestrians, and we've already seen the dangers of automated image recognition technology. The incitement of violence and division. It's been widely reported about the ways social media has been used to sow division in national conflicts, and the example here on the slide is that Facebook lets vigilantes in Ethiopia incite ethnic killing. And then final example here, the wide-scale harvesting of personal data, which is then used to influence public opinion and even the outcome of elections, which we saw so clearly in the Cambridge Analytica scandal a few years ago. So the problem isn't going away. And it's not a small-scale issue relegated to a few bad apples. It's impacting all of us and is disproportionately affecting the most historically marginalized in society. But equally, calling out these examples is not meant to demonize the designers or the product teams that shipped these products. Many of us, myself included, have been in high-pressured environments where there's this pressure to deliver, insane deadlines, and decisions that happen that are completely outside of our control. And often this doesn't allow us time to fully consider these unintended consequences and the potential impact of our designs. So this isn't really about blame, it's about realizing that our decisions have real consequences on people's lives and empowering ourselves to recognize the opportunities where we can intervene. So moving on to what we can do, I think we'll start with more high-level frameworks and then move into some concrete practical tips, hopefully, that you can take away. But just as a caveat here, like with the definitions, there's not one definitive framework that's going to solve this problem. And designing products and services that work for real people is a really messy business. I think even though they won't solve it, frameworks can be useful as they give us a different perspective and can be helpful for us to think through problems of inclusion and equity and ethics, these kind of complex problems. So various organizations and people who are interested in ethical design have conceptualized different models to help us rethink the way that we design products and services. And they're challenging some of the existing models that can be problematic, like design thinking, the model that you can see on the slide. And Kat Cho, who came up with the design ethically framework, said, today we see many design frameworks and processes that have been successful in defining North Stars and outlining methods for delineating problems and developing solutions. What these frameworks share in common when applied by businesses is that they are often built on a motivating foundation of making more profits. Rarely do you see an ethical component factored into the equation. So Cho came up with the design ethically framework, which builds on that design thinking model that makes several key distinctions. So first of all, it splits out the process into intents and results. And the intent stage is to think about, is this a problem that's really worthy for us to solve? The results stage looks at what consequences does our solution have. She's also added in some additional steps here to the typical model. So the step of evaluate is critical. It involves analysing the problem statement and seeing if there's, whether it's even ethically worthy of being addressed in the first place. So for example, if your company is trying to develop a tool that hurts thousands of people for the sake of profit or growth, you might want to heavily reconsider it. But I mean, the caveat here is that most of us and most companies aren't going to be openly, visibly working on things that are unintentionally unethical. It would be pretty bad for PR if these companies were openly creating these products. And most companies will have crafted a pitch for their product that seems ethically sound, and that's how they can kind of convince venture capitalists to invest and get users to jump on board. So this stage is rarely the problematic part, but it is important to consider. In the second phase, she's added the steps of forecast, which encourages you to take a look at the ideas that you've generated through ideation, and for each idea, figure out any ethical weak spots or potential ways that your product could be exploited in an unethical way and lead to these unintended consequences. So either by users or by the company itself, by investors or other stakeholders, and really kind of scrutinizing what could happen at this stage that mean that your design doesn't work in the way that you intended. And crucially, finally, she adds monitor onto the end. So design thinking usually stops short at the kind of test stage, but Joe says, once it's gone live, you need to monitor so that you're continually checking in on this shipped product to see if any ethical problems or problems with inclusion occur so that your team can quickly mobilize to solve them. Another model here is liberatory design, which builds on the design thinking model again, but it aims to shift the relationship between the people who hold power and those impacted by the designs by considering the systems in which the process is situated. And this means, again, slowing down, not rushing to decisions without considering the consequences on the people who will be impacted by the designs. And there's some similar steps here to that design ethically evaluate and forecast steps. They talk about notice and reflect to encourage us to slow down and move and think more deeply throughout the design process. So this is in direct contrast to that Silicon Valley motto I mentioned earlier of move fast and break things. To design ethically, we need to be clear about what we value. And if our key values are things like growth, innovation, and profit, things are unlikely to change. We need more designers and more companies to value things like inclusion and psychological safety and transparency if we want to see better outcomes for users and society. And thinking back to our earlier examples, how might things have been different if the designers had had the time to think deeply, to forecast, and to reflect on the potential unintended consequences of their designs? Could these frustrating, tragic, and dangerous experiences have been avoided for those users? But I hear you say, that's not realistic. We often don't have time or resources to be able to move slowly and reflect. And I agree. I think these conceptual models can only go so far, and they are helpful as thinking tools. But often the issues run a lot deeper than what we can actually solve at an individual level or an individual team level. We need resources, we need diverse teams, we need regulation, organizational change, and ultimately we need societal change for these things to really have impact. And I think without buy-in at the organizational level, teams won't really be able to apply these sorts of models because they need to be given that time. And because these are systemic issues, they need systemic solutions, which are a lot bigger often than what we can do as individual designers. And if you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to take a look at the Centre for Humane Technologies framework for changing complex systems, which discusses the leverage points for influencing systemic change. And it acknowledges that culture change really is slow work, but that it requires both a bottom-up and a top-down approach for any interventions in this area to succeed. So it's going to take a bit of time, but in the meantime, I wanted to give you some practical steps that you can take away to design with ethics in mind in your kind of day-to-day work. So applying it in practice, the foundational step in making a difference with ethical design, I think, is just education and awareness. So I'll share some resources at the end of the session if you want to dig deeper, but learning about ethical design and kind of spotting these things in practice is so, so important, and it helps you pause and ask questions when you become more aware of what's going on. Next one is around user research. So observing user research, encouraging the team to observe user research. And I mostly work in the public sector where grounding everything in robust research is expected. But in practice, it doesn't always happen. And I know in lots of private sector organizations as well, it In-depth research doesn't necessarily happen, but getting the whole team to watch real users interacting with your service is so key to understanding the barriers that they face. You can't truly empathize with a persona on a piece of paper. You need to engage with real people to understand how the work you're doing might impact them. And if we think back to our example, how might it have been different if Google had tested their photo tagging algorithm with someone like Jackie Alcine and his friend before it went live, and them having to realize that error when it was already live. And just on a side note here, I was having a conversation with a colleague yesterday about research ethics, and there's some really fascinating work going on in that area that's really, really tightly linked to all this thinking on design ethics. Catherine Collins spoke about this earlier today as well, if you caught her talk. So in terms of research ethics, we're specifically thinking about how we can engage in research in a participatory way, learning through people's lived experiences, and not being extractive through our research practice. It's also thinking about how we can ensure psychological safety for both the participant and the researchers, and mitigating risks from vicarious trauma in research sessions. So there's a lot wrapped up in this step of engaging deeply in meaningful research. The next one I've got here is monitor. So taking that from the design ethically model, reviewing live services with real users regularly. So not thinking that our work has stopped once a service or a product goes live. Monitoring is key to helping us find barriers that users face or unintended consequences that we didn't predict before the service went live. And I know that we'd obviously prefer to deal with any of these problems prior to going live, but sometimes the pressure to deliver pushes something out the door before we've had a chance to address absolutely everything that we'd like to. Or maybe the problem crops up in live and you hadn't even anticipated that during design and development. Either way, having systems in place to keep a really, really close eye on your live service means that you can respond swiftly to issues that arrive and protect users. And when I was working on the COVID test and trace service, we had a live survey running 24/7, and we got thousands and thousands of responses every week. And our user researcher would scour through those to spot any issues that were cropping up for people. And we could then respond directly to things that people were spotting in the service that meant that it wasn't as inclusive as they needed it to be, so that we could go and fix those issues. And it goes back to questions of intent and impact. We're responsible for the impacts this service has once it's live, not just the design of it. And finally, taking time to reflect, forecast and challenge by asking open questions. I think one of the best tools we have when we want to speak up on something is to ask open, non-confrontational questions. If you think something isn't right, asking a question can be the way to address it. For example, maybe there's been no research done on your product with users with access needs, or no research done at all. Or maybe your boss or company is asking you to collect some data that you think is completely unnecessary to the delivery of the service. Without accusing and without being confrontational, you can ask a question like why, or should this be something that we're considering and thinking about? And it can subtly challenge others to move in a more inclusive direction. And looking for opportunities to bring up things like accessibility, inclusion, diversity, and some of the questions that we've discussed today around ethical design choices, and bringing those into the conversation. So to wrap up on the key points that we've talked about today, we defined ethical design as a combination of what you do, how you do it, who is involved in the process, and how you sustain it long term. We talked about the fact that it's important because the work we produce can be responsible for creating harms at significant scale, and it impacts real people's lives, and we have a responsibility to mitigate or eradicate those harms. And finally, we discussed some practical tips for shifting our processes to ensure we think about needs and harms early and often and throughout. And I wanted to share this quote from the brilliant Mike Monteiro, who really inspired me to get more involved in thinking about design ethics. And what he says is, as designers, we need to see ourselves as gatekeepers of what we are bringing into the world and what we choose not to bring into the world. And if I can leave you with one thing, it's this, that in our roles, we're uniquely positioned to influence. We might not always feel like it, but we have a significant amount of power just by being the people who are in the room and making decisions. And we have a lot more power in influencing outcomes than the thousands or millions of people who will end up using our services, for example. So if you start thinking of yourself as a gatekeeper and remembering that you have power to ask questions and have these challenging conversations, I think that's really, really important. And sometimes these things don't get considered because we just assume that it's somebody else's responsibility, maybe the product manager or a key stakeholder or a client. But I would challenge you to make it your responsibility to bring up these questions and have these conversations when you're researching and designing. So just as a final slide there, there's some great organizations doing loads of work in this area. I'll call them out. There's Design Justice Network, Centre for Humane Technology, All Tech is Human, and the Ethical Design Network. And there's lots of others as well. And I've also included a link to a resource list, which was compiled by Lexi Namer. It has articles, videos, podcasts, books, all about ethical design. And that's at ethicaldesignresources.com if you want to do some more reading and learning in this area. So thank you.
Top stuff. Thank you very, very much, Kate. A lot of the complexity, I think, comes from the fact that organizations shift and evolve. I mean, we all know of a famous company whose mantra was "Don't be evil," who subsequently have perhaps engaged in things that don't necessarily conform to that. Do you know of any big companies who are actively trying to include ethical considerations in their design processes?
It's an interesting one because I think this is a really hot topic. So you do see some of those big companies who are named as being really problematic, who do have whole departments for AI ethics or design ethics. So there was at Google, there's a researcher called Timnit Gebru, I think is how you pronounce her name, who was researching academic research into ethics and presenting this back. And she ended up leaving the company because they just weren't taking what she was saying on board. So actually a lot of these big players do pay lip service to it, but whether they're really, really engaging in it, I don't know. And it's quite hard to see from the outside because they talk a lot about it. You don't know how much they're actually listening to it. So another example was that one with Frances Haugen at Facebook. A lot of research had been done to find out that the mental health of teenagers was being affected by Instagram. But when it got presented back and a difficult decision had to be made about what do we do about this, Facebook decided to discount it. So yes and no, they are engaging in it, but then how far are they actually following through? And I think that's where some of the challenges are at the moment.
So what you're saying, to paraphrase, tell me if I'm wrong, for some organizations, the presence of an ethics committee or ethics department isn't necessarily a good sign. It could actively be a fig leaf over systemic problems, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. And I think they are picking up on the fact that so many people care about this now. People are trying to hold people to account. So Centre for Humane Technology is a fantastic organisation that's really trying to hold these big companies to account and going to Capitol Hill and talking about regulation with the US government. But how much they're responding, I think, is yet to be seen because a lot of it's behind closed doors. So yeah, it is real kind of culture change stuff that I think will take some time.
Yeah, I suppose as well that one person's ethical problem is somebody else's. Well, that's just business, or that's the world as well. There's no objective standard against which things can be measured, is there?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why I talked about it coming back to values. You have to be clear on what your own values are as a designer. Do I want to get involved in something like that? Because some organizations will, and that's what they choose to align themselves with. And other people might not want to be involved in that environment. And you kind of need people on both sides. So Mike Montero talks about, should all the designers just get up and leave Facebook if it's unethical? But he mentions actually you need people on the inside who have that ethical framework. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, I'm going to leave because it doesn't align. It's about those leverage points again. Where can you influence? So yeah, it's a complex area.
And maybe perhaps this is a slightly ambushy question, so apologies if it is, and tell me off. But do you know if there are design ethics included in formal design courses or education tracks? Should that be a thing if it's not a thing already?
I think a lot of the time there's not. There's definitely more of a movement towards it now. So Design Justice Network are up on the screen. They have some principles of design justice, and they encourage people to become signatories to it. So it's more of an informal way of saying, yes, I sign on to these principles, and that's what I'm going to live and work in my practice. But there's nothing more formal than that at the moment. And in that book that I had up on the screen, Ruined by Design, Mike Montero, he talks about coming up with accreditation for designers. He says that if you're going to become a doctor, you need to take a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, because you're impacting people's lives, and that's a key part of having that role as a practitioner. And he's saying, well, designers have these roles that can impact millions of people. Should they not also have to take some sort of oath or get some sort of accreditation that says, I'm going to do this by an ethical standard? And I think it's a really interesting argument. And yeah, I think he's probably right in that.
That's a good thought, isn't it? A Hippocratic oath for designers. We call it the Figma-matic oath or something like that, perhaps. Anyway, Patrick, over to you, sir. Thank you very much, Kate. That was highly illuminating.
Thank you.
Yeah, and also thank you, Kate, from me. And I also wanted to say sorry for the kind of tonal shift from our very jokey intro to your very deep and serious topic. It was a bit of a whiplash there, so sorry about that. Right, so for the audience and children at home, if you like this session, hit that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to our channel to be kept in the loop for all our future events. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Inclusive Design 24 wouldn't be possible without the help of our supporters, Intopia, Fable, Barrier Break, TPGI, UX for the Win, Equal Entry, Infoaxia, Intuit, Law Office of Lady Feingold, Adrian Rosselli LLC, and Webable. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session. So once again, thank you, and see everybody there.